Now that we've covered the pictograms, there are three main label types that we should discuss. And these are supplier labels, workplace labels, and other. There's also a fourth label related to sending laboratory samples for testing, but that applies more to sending research chemicals for testing rather than undergraduate chemistry labs, so we can ignore that one for now. Supplier labels are the most detailed. They have a lot of information. The workplace labels have still a fair amount, but much less, and the other labels are going to contain very little information. And labels are important because they let a worker know that a chemical is potentially hazardous. And in addition, they should tell you the major hazards associated with that project and the basic things that you should be doing in order to stay safe. These images represent actual real labels from UNB, and they underscore the reason why labeling is so important. Some of these labels are overwritten, some of them are stacked on top of older labels where they might fall off, and it really drives the point home that clear labeling is really important as far as safety is concerned. We'll look in detail at a supplier label first because it's the most informative. These labels have to be made by the supplier, and there are 6 requirements for these labels. Number 1 is a product identifier. This is the name that the company that's supplying the chemicals is calling it. So for most chemicals that we'll be encountering, they'll be pure chemicals, so things like hydrochloric acid, but it can also be whatever trade name that the company is calling their chemical mixture. Number 2 are the hazard pictograms for that chemical. Number 3 is a signal word, and there are only 2 possible signal words, and they are danger or warning. So even in a very, very safe material with few hazards, there's still going to be a signal word, and that word will be warning because it's relatively non-hazardous. The 4th requirement are hazard statements. So these are statements that tell you what the hazards are for that chemical, what the dangers are. The next requirement are precautionary statements. These are standardized pieces of language that tell you how to deal safely with that material. So they're a statement that tells you how to deal with the hazards. So these include things like wear gloves or goggles, dispose of in accordance with regulations, things like that. The 6th requirement is supplier identification, so an address and phone number typically. And in Canada, we require that supplier labels be bilingual as well. Workplace labels are labels that are developed in the workplace and are used when the chemical has been decanted, so it's been transferred out of its supplier container into a new container. And there are only 3 workplace label requirements. These requirements are product identifier, the same type of identifier as in the supplier label, precautionary statements, again, as described in the supplier labels, and a reference to the safety data sheet. And this can be as simple as a statement saying, please refer to the safety data sheet for more information. Historically, these were physical references, so please look in the blue filing cabinet in room 3 for the safety data sheet. But because most of us have access to the internet on our telephones or computers, we can save PDF versions of all of these safety data sheets. Now, a workplace label requires these 3 things, but it can also include extra information. So it can include pictograms or hazard statements or anything else that you think is relevant. Other labels can be used in certain sets of circumstances. So you can use an other label if you pour out a product, you decant a product into a new container, and that product stays under your control, and the name of that chemical is marked on your container, and all of that product is going to be used up during your shift or during your experiment or something like that. And in research and academic labs, this is pretty much what we use. So you would have commonly seen something like 0.103 molar HCl as a label on some of your chemicals in previous labs. And it's important to note that the label has to convey clear warning to the employees who are using it. So in a chemistry lab where you've learned about molarity and you've learned about acids, This would be enough information for you to safely say this is a fairly dilute acid, so the risk of burns is minimal. But in a different context, say if we were requiring bank office workers to use this material, 0.103 molar HCl would not be a clear enough label, and you would need to include more information. So things like, this is a dilute acid that can cause burns, avoid contact with skin and eyes, something like that. So the other label allows you to use less information if you have a trained workforce. So as a worker, you have label responsibilities. So if you're working with a material, you need to check to see if there is a label, and you need to be able to understand the label's instructions. And if the label is fading or falling off, you personally are required to either fix it or bring it to somebody who can fix it at that point. But you're not allowed to just leave and say, oh, the next person to use it will fix it. You have to make sure that it's dealt with at that time. And if you're pouring out a material into a new container, you need to make sure that you are attaching a workplace label if you're going to have leftover chemical after your shift.